Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. Welcome back to Rochester Security Summit 2024, day number 2. Our speaker right now is getting set up a little bit. He'll be right up here in just a moment. Quick reminder, please silence your phones if you haven't done so already. It can be a little bit of a panic if you get a loud call on your phone, somebody's talking. Well, while we're waiting, I'd like to give a nice shout out to the vendors who've sponsored many aspects of the conference. The delicious lunch we all have, for instance, the nice setups of the rooms. Special call out, of course, to ProArch and Just Solutions, who sponsored this room. So, with that being said, I would like to introduce Michael Kosak, and he will be speaking. Ta-da.
Yes. Perfect. There we go. Well, thank you very much, everybody, for coming. I know there's a lot of great talks, so I'm really, truly flattered that you would choose this one to spend your time listening to. Thank you very much again, and I know certainly after lunch is always a tough spot. I'll try and keep this engaging and exciting because I know everybody just had some of that awesome food, so I'll try and pep it up a little bit. So my name is Mike Kosak. I've been with LastPass now for about a year and a half. Just a quick background on myself. So I started in the U.S. intelligence community, was a senior intelligence officer there, focused primarily, actually exclusively on counterterrorism for the first 10 to 15 years of my career or so. Moved into cybersecurity about 10 years ago. Spent 6 years at Bank of America leading their strategic cyber threat intelligence team. And then they stood up a new team while I was there that was focused on operationalizing threat intelligence, the threat defense organization, helped stand that up. Led the cyber threat intelligence team at TIAA for a little bit before then coming to LastPass. So quite a long career that kind of got me here. So with that said, we'll go ahead and start. So what I want to talk about is the threat from Infostealers to every company. So irrespective of size, irrespective of maturity of the organization, this is something that we see, we as in the larger information security, see impacting just about anybody. It's a threat that's really grown over the last couple of years. We'll talk about that in more detail. We'll get into how they work and kind of what that ecosystem looks like. And then we'll just kind of touch really quickly at the end on steps you can take to protect yourself. So I like to keep these conversational. If you have questions as I'm going through, please feel free to jump in, but we'll get started. So just to kind of start with a quick look at why we're worried about this typically, and that's around data breaches. About, average cost is about $5 million. Obviously, that can vary quite a bit. You think about some of the large breaches we've seen just over the last year and the financial impact of that. You think about what Graham talked about earlier with Capital One, the data breach costing about $270 million. So, that $5 million is the average. It certainly falls on either side of that bell curve. You can see here, these are really across all sectors, with healthcare being largely impacted as the number one. But really, no sector is immune from this. That's really important to remember. And that most of these are sourced back to compromised credentials, either from phishing or Infostealers. So just to kind of start out with what's at stake and what we're concerned about when we think about Infostealers. So now, Infostealers are just part of a larger community of how these compromised credentials are getting out there. And we'll take a few minutes just to look at different ways this is happening. So starting with phishing, if you just sat in on the FBI's briefing, they did a really good job talking through this. Certainly this has been around for a long time, as Special Agent Rogers mentioned, starting with sort of, the Nigerian 429 scams, trying to get people to send money and that sort of thing, and how it's progressed to where we are now over the last 20 years. really, when we think about some of the changes we've seen specifically with phishing itself, you think about the impact of AI over the last 2 years. One stat I saw indicates that there's been a 1,200% increase in phishing emails over the last year or two because ChatGPT and these other LLMs are being used to drive this sort of fraudulent activity at scale. There's even dedicated LLMs, Fraud GPT, real clever name, really hiding what they're up to is a good example. But so it's allowing people to do this a lot faster, hit a lot more people. The other thing it's done is if you think about sort of the classic tells that, when you think about it from a cybersecurity awareness perspective, that you tell people to look out for with phishing, look out for bad grammar, look out for misspellings, that sort of thing, all that's out the window. So from a social engineering and sort of tactic, techniques, and procedures, or TTP perspective, that's changed rapidly in the last couple of years. So that's really made a big difference there. The other things we've seen are really avenues of delivery, these attack vectors. So quishing has risen to the forefront, the QR codes, vishing, the voicemail phishing, smishing, SMS. We at LastPass at one point have even experienced, and we wrote about this pretty widely, we experienced an audio deepfake for vishing, where somebody impersonated our CEO. No impact because we've got a robust security awareness program. Everybody did the right thing and reported it quickly. But so phishing and sort of the broader category there has really is really evolving and still a concern. And as Special Agent Rogers mentioned. Credential stuffing, this is often what we'll see with previously exposed credentials. Usually, the last stat I saw was about 60% of people still reuse passwords. So this is exactly why these threat actors are still doing this, taking credentials that are available through any number of avenues, Telegram, Discord, dark web, anywhere they can get these, and then just basically taking spray and pray approaches, just firing them at a bunch of different accounts, counting on people reusing passwords, and then the fact that it still works is why they're still doing it. So again, going back to that 60% statistic. Data breaches. I won't belabor this one. There's not a ton new. It's all kind of right in the name there. This is information that's getting out usually through third parties. These are what I'll often feed into credential stuffing too. It's kind of the classic, customer data getting out there or something along those lines that can then be reused, especially if it includes credential data. Attacker in the middle attacks. There's sort of two trends we're seeing here with this, specifically around credentials. One is, and this is more on the nation state side, targeting of ISPs to try and kind of move upstream and get access to more data more quickly. You've seen a couple of reports probably on this over the last couple weeks, and actually just one in the last week of China targeting US ISPs to try and get access to data upstream. The other thing we're seeing more from a sort of customer and small to mid-sized business perspective is the targeting of routers. Routers have long been a weak point in supply chains and in cybersecurity. There's still a lot that are out there that are end of life, that have a ton of vulnerabilities, that are still using admin or default passwords. So we find threat actors targeting these to basically drop password sniffers into the router itself and try and pull credentials out of clear text and then pass them on. And then finally, why I'm here is to talk about Infostealers. And this is, for those who aren't aware, malware that gathers all sorts of critical information from an infected machine, ranging from credentials to browser information, operating system information. We'll talk about that a lot more as we dig in here, but so we'll move on from there. So when I talk about Infostealers as a growing threat, this is what I mean. So in 2023, Infostealer activity increased 266%. There were 343.78 million credentials stolen in 2023 from one report. Each infection on average exposing 10 to 25 third-party business applications, which obviously just propagates the problem even further. And the interesting thing, oftentimes when you think about Infostealers as a malware, you think, okay, well, I have EDR, I have XDR, I have antivirus protection. SpyCloud, in a report that was released last year in Infostealer investigations that they did, 54% of the victim machines had active EDR or active antivirus. So, and we'll talk about a little bit more about why they're still successful in the face of that, but just gives you a sense of the pervasiveness of this issue, the effectiveness of these infostealers, and why they're so commonplace. And then finally, according to the Verizon DBIR, about 1,000 credentials are posted online a day. These are cheap. Again, Special Agent Rogers mentioned, kind of talked about this. Their availability, they've essentially been commoditized at this point. Average cost is about $10 a day. Some of them are just free. Some of them are a lot more, depending on if they've been verified and have been proven to have actual access to a particular organization. So they can, the value is there. The other thing is, and this will play into the conversation later, about 65% of these credentials and InfoStealer logs are posted within 1 day of being collected. So from victim machine to the dark web or whatever marketplace or Telegram or Discord is, flash to bang on that is less than a day. Oh, one more thing I do want to call out, just to give you a sense of I forgot the graph up there. Just to give you a sense of what this looks like compared to, say, botnets, which if you think about, 5-10 years ago was kind of the big concern. This has the Neckers botnet on there, Game Over Zeus, two of the big ones from 8 years ago. This is from Hudson Rock. This is their database that they're pulling from. But just to give a sense of the scale, if you think about Neckers as being one of the biggest botnet threats that everybody was talking about 5 to 8 years ago, and they're looking at, I think it's 8 to 9 million. I don't have my glasses on, so that's going to be a tough read. But and it obviously jumps up a lot more. 27.5 million with the InfoStealers as far as from what they've seen in their investigations over time. So almost threefold increase over something that's really only been in serious play for the last 2 to 3 years. Whereas again, if you think about the length of time that people were concerned about botnets, not saying that they're not a concern now, but even those biggest botnets just aren't comparing to the sort of numbers that we're seeing with InfoStealer infections. So digging in a little bit more detail on InfoStealers themselves. So they've, and we'll get into a case study here in a bit, but really InfoStealers can be linked to some of the biggest breaches that you've seen in the news over the last year, particularly in 2024. There's two in particular that I can think of, one of which you can draw a direct through line from a single breached credential for a VPN to a $1.6 billion loss. So, the company involved with that was, to their credit, very upfront about the costs and what happened. So it allows, it really highlights the issue. It makes it easy to underscore why this is so important when a single credential can cost $1.6 billion. These are designed to run very quickly, usually within seconds, from the initial time of infection to the time they run. Then they'll delete the forensic evidence usually, so it can be hard to even verify that there even was an InfoStealer infection. So they're very well crafted, typically, in a way to maximize their effectiveness and minimize their footprint. These are typically operated as a malware as a service. So for a lot of people, that really lowers the technological barrier of entry. If you just need to get on, you can, it's kind of the classic as a service model that you see within the criminal ecosystem. Pay a certain amount of money to them. They'll give you everything you need, and you can just jump right in and go from there. Types of InfoStealer malware include credential stealers, email stealers, FTP stealers, keyloggers, form grabbers, browser hijackers. There's a lot of screen grabbers too. Oftentimes these are all consolidated into one InfoStealer, so this isn't by any way mutually exclusive as far as functionality across the malware. But just there are some that specialize, there are some that bring a little bit of everything to the table. One of the recent developments we've seen within InfoStealers is an automated OCR function within these screen grabbers to where they'll pull out critical information, pass it immediately as soon as the screen grab happens to a live individual who's monitoring the C2, and then they'll act on it very, very quickly, again, just highlighting that. We've got a simplified attack chain here at the bottom on what it looks like as far as initial infection vectors. There's a couple of different ways this is happening. Malvertising, malspam, phishing, the usual approach. Infected websites, and cracked software is another very common one. What we tend to see a lot of is cracked software and combined with YouTube channels and SEO poisoning. So directing people to YouTube channels saying, hey, here's a cracked version of the software. Well, they don't even advertise as a cracked version of the software. Advertising a software saying this is very useful, kind of hyping it up. Then buried within that software will be an infostealer, which again, once it gets in, acts very quickly and then, then pulls the data out. It'll package the data up very quickly, send it out to the C2 or Telegram or Discord channel, and then erase itself, and then it goes from there. So to these initial access brokers, and we'll talk a little bit more about that in a minute. On the right of this screen, I've got an example of an Infostealer log that we took from Flashpoint, who we work with very closely. It gives you a good sense of what the data is and the amount of data that's stolen. So especially if you think about it in a couple of seconds, it's location of the infection, which can be useful because a lot of times once cyber criminals start acting on this, they'll use residential proxies to try and mimic whoever the victim was, to at least get in the ballpark, to avoid impossible travel alerts. All the credentials, obviously, usually browser-based. That's what a lot of this is focused on. So you'll see there, it's pulling from Chrome, it's pulling from Edge, it's pulling from Safari, it's pulling autofills, passwords, all that sort of stuff. It pulls information on the operating system, what processes are running, what other software is on that machine, and this is really for the purpose of developing a fingerprint that they can mimic later. So digging in a little bit more on Infostealers and why there are so many of them. So one of the things that we've seen, even just over the last 2 years, about a year or two ago, there was about 20 Infostealers out there that were in major play. Now it's up well over 50. There's constantly more coming out. There's a couple of things driving this. There's sort of the human factor in which there's a lot of tension between these groups. Personal relationships will drive this. There'll be an argument within the group. You see this within ransomware families all the time too. They'll get frustrated with each other. They don't feel like they're making enough money, so they go off and they do their own thing. That's the human side of it. Or they may get burned. There's just a ton of stuff. The other thing that drives this is there's several really good Infostealers that have had their source code leaked so that it's really easy for somebody to just take that source code, tweak it, and declare it as their own. So they just rename it, they'll add functionality, they'll change whatever they don't like, put a new interface or panel on it, and then that's it. So it makes it really easy. They're small files, often less than 1 meg. So again, going to why some of these are so effective, like they can fly under the radar oftentimes. As I said, they're designed to run and delete themselves within seconds, which makes forensic investigations difficult. We really see what's driving a lot of this, or if we think about the larger cyber criminal ecosystem, there's been a sort of specialization of labor over time. So, it's almost like if you think about the Industrial Revolution, and where initially it was just everybody's trying to, every factory is trying to do everything from end to end, and then over time as industry sort of matured, you had people start specializing on different things. That's kind of where we're at now with the cyber criminal ecosystem. So initial access brokers really focusing on getting their foot in that front door. A lot of it is credential-based. Some of it will be zero-day based. Some of it will be social engineering. You think about a group like Scattered Spider, who have been in the news a lot for the last couple of years because they're really good with social engineering. Although it's not even like they have to be that good. Sometimes you listen to some of these calls and they're just winging it, but it's still highly effective. And then as I kind of started alluding to as we were looking at the larger logs, what they'll do with this data once they get that information is use oftentimes an anti-detect browser, which is highly customizable, so they can mimic the footprint of whoever that victim was to the greatest degree possible. So if you think about from a defense in depth approach, you want an antivirus to pick it up, but they've gotten really good at avoiding that. Oftentimes, these will execute in memory, or they'll leverage existing, sort of living off the land approach. They'll leverage existing tools or processes within the machine. So they'll leverage that. The other thing they want to do is try and, because they know from a fraud detection standpoint or account takeover protection standpoint, there will be other protections in place. So device fingerprint is different, so you want to try and mimic that to the greatest degree possible. Location is different. Okay, so, 8 hours ago, this individual was trying to log in from Des Moines, Iowa, and now they're trying to log in from St. Petersburg, Russia. That seems strange. So that's why, they'll use these residential proxies. That sort of market within cybercrime has grown a ton over the last year or two as well, or last couple years really. So really, it's this integration of a number of highly organized organizations that are allowing this to work, even within the initial access broker ecosystem itself. So there's subspecializations within the specialization. The bring your own device, this is part of what the drive has been over the last couple of years. The bring your own device issue just creates a massive attack surface. There's a lot of examples of companies who have had their credentials exposed, either because they're using their own device to access a work account, so the credentials get pulled that way, or they're logging into like a personal Gmail account on a company machine. So, which is obviously not the same as bring your own device, but when you think about it from those perspectives, that's where sometimes, that's driven some of this explosion as well, is because really it's a focus on opportunity. And then finally, from the bullet point perspective, we've seen an increased focus on session cookies over time for a couple of reasons. One, it's a great way, especially if the session cookies don't expire quickly enough. It's a great way to get around MFA. It's a great way to get around passwords. If you can act quickly enough, like I said, I just talked about how quickly some of these get out there. That gets you around that. The other thing is, as people start to think about passkeys and passwordless solutions, session cookies become kind of the next best thing. We've monitored conversations within the dark web between cyber criminals who are talking about this and are concerned about passwordless and passkeys, and that's usually where they see themselves as going next. Now, obviously, there's, and then it's kind of the whack-a-mole continues, the arms race continues between, okay, well, now we've got to put better protections in place, we've got to have our session cookies expire more quickly, but then it becomes a customer experience thing. There's all kinds of, it's a long conversation. But anyway, that's kind of where we tend to see threat actors going next as they consider this sort of push to passwordless. Obviously, the bow wave on that has been long. We're still in the sort of beginning stages of that adoption. But as it does, we can expect to see that sort of evolution and response. I've got a breakout of what a typical Infostealer group itself looks like here that I took from a great brief from Ji-Ho Kim at S2W. She did an awesome job breaking this down. So this is typically what you'll see. There's an admin who's kind of running everything, putting it together. You've got coders who are, as you'd expect, actually writing the code. Moderators, so oftentimes you'll see, particularly for the bigger Infostealers, so like Luma C2 is one of the biggest ones right now. You can get out there in Telegram, go to the Luma C2. They're not trying to hide it. You go to the Luma C2's channel. There's a Luma C2 seller moderator on there that you can just talk to about buying this as a service. Prices typically run, depending on the malware and everything else, from $100 if you're using it as a service, sometimes up to $2,000. I think last time I checked for Luma, it was around $250 a month. So they're out there trying to sell it, which is like I said, what you'll see. There'll be a moderator who's kind of running the channel overall, and then also moderating wherever these sales are happening or wherever these interactions, the interface between the product itself, the Infostealer, and the customers. There'll be a moderator that's sort of overseeing that. You've got a group or individuals that are focused on traffic. So this is them trying to get it out there. This goes to the YouTube clips or the YouTube videos that I was talking about and the SEO poisoning. Often you'll see in the parlance, like if you're monitoring conversations within forums or something like that, they're referred to as traffers. This is what they focus on. It's just trying to get that word out there. And then finally, infrastructure. These are the individuals in the group that are focused on setting up the back-end aspects of it, C2 servers, channels, however else they're going to get this out there, get it to operate, and really sort of do the logistics on getting the Infostealer to run. So once they're out there, how are these sold? There's a couple of different ways. The way I've certainly mentioned the most here is dark web marketplaces. This is what most people think of. You know, you go out, you look for logs. There's still a lot out there. Russian market's a great example. Genesis market is a great example. You know, it's really easy to get on there and just find whatever you need. There's still, you know, I think we're starting to see that diffuse a little bit, or more and more over time. But still, you know, still probably the go-to place for buying these Infostealer logs. Hacker forums, if you think about like Breach Forum or some of these other ones that end up in the news, these are a little bit more focused on, they're not just focused on trying to sell. They're sort of broader conversations, but you'll see stuff drop in there every once in a while like, hey, I've got this information, or I've got this access. Excuse me. You know, I've got validated access to, you know, X bank, for instance, who wants this. So you'll see that sold as well. The interesting thing is, especially with that side of it, once you've kind of got this validated access, you tend to find an intersection between cybercriminal and nation state a lot more, where, you know, they'll sell this access to a nation state. They don't even know who necessarily they're talking to. There's also plenty of examples of collusion between nation states and cybercriminals. But that's often where you'll kind of find that intersection is on the sales of these access. Private sales and direct deals, same thing. That tends to be that intersection too. But also it can, yeah, you sort of build up these relationships, and it's sort of a one-to-one communication. Once trust is established and that sort of thing, this information, you know, they'll sell that access directly. Auction sites, it's very straightforward. Hey, I've got this data. I've got, you know, a 3 terabit file. It includes X number of data. Oftentimes, they'll sort of include the file directory for the data to say, here's an example of what you can expect to see, the sort of data we've pulled out, and then they'll run an auction. And then oftentimes what they'll do too is, I guess you see it kind of one of both ways. One is, once it's sold, it's gone. The other thing they'll do is, first access, whoever buys it, then I'm going to release it. And there, you know, because then obviously the advantage to whoever buys it is they get first access. They get a little extra time to get their foot in the door and start, you know, actions on objective. And then finally, reselling and brokering. Again, going to that sort of specialization of labor. Okay, I've got these logs, but I don't want to deal with the sales side of it. Here, you know, I work with this group. You go take this and sell it. You go post this. You'll see this sometimes. I'm trying to think. I think it was Intel brokers earlier this year did this a couple of times. They'll get data and say, hey, one of our connections passed us this, and we've got this for sale. I think US DoD has done it too. This isn't an uncommon approach either. It's sort of, I think oftentimes it's just sort of plausible deniability that they're trying to create. But, you know, that's something too. And then also, you know, it's not on here, but again, going back to these sort of direct channels with Telegram and Discord, sometimes they'll just scrape these credentials and just dump them straight into these channels for free. So it's, you know, it's just kind of the classic, some people just want to watch the world burn type approach. Or if they've looked at them, they're not interested in them, they'll just dump them in there. So just a quick case study. And I want to make clear, I'm not putting anybody on blast. It's just this is really illustrative. I think everybody involved with this did a really good job of being transparent and talking through it. Snowflake and Mandiant did an awesome job. I actually pulled the graphics that they included in their after action, which only came out like a week or two after all this started. But, excuse me, in late May, a threat actor started advertising data from Ticketmaster and Santander, saying that they had breached Snowflake itself and pulled the data out of there. Subsequent analysis by Snowflake in conjunction with Mandiant, they kind of said, hey, whoa, that wasn't us. It was them using compromised credentials, and they were able to confirm that. They said that Infostealers are the source of most of the credentials for these breaches that they saw, if not all of them. At the time, MFA was not the default setting for Snowflake accounts. So a lot of these, it was just these credentials. That's all somebody needed. Threat actor found that and then just bought up every Snowflake credential they could find and then just started trying to log in and had a lot of success with it. A financially motivated threat actor was associated with this. I don't know how much you follow. If you don't follow threat actor naming conventions within the threat intelligence community, it's maddening. But UNC 5537, which just means they're an unassigned cybercriminal threat group. They're not necessarily associated with any of the bigger known threat groups. But they were found to be behind the campaign, which is not surprising. And there hasn't been a bunch more on this since, but roughly 165 companies may have been impacted as part of this, with hundreds more still available. The interesting thing with some of these credentials, too, some were very fresh, and I mean some that were used in actual attacks. Some were very fresh, where they were within a couple of months. Some of these credentials were years old. They hadn't been changed. They had been out on the dark web for years. So, really kind of a bomb waiting to go off, lingering out there. So, if we look at the kill chain, like I said, it really was recon somehow, and I haven't seen anything on how they initially detected these credentials, found them, figured out that there weren't a lot, the MFA was not the default setting, so that probably meant, there were going to be some opportunities. It's like, if you think about, and you still see it from time to time, but certainly like 5 years ago, all of the exposed Elastic databases or S3 buckets and stuff like that, whereas people were, I think there's still some kind of standardization of security practices and that sort of thing. And then they just simply logged in, pulled the data out. They used a custom utility and a publicly available database management utility to sort of collect the data and then push it out the door so that they could then advertise the data and sell it and monetize that data. So finally, what can you do about this? Awareness is really key here. Knowing what you're looking for and where to find it. So, and this is really from sort of a threat intelligence perspective. Monitoring third-party data breaches. So people you're doing business with is certainly one that's really from a supply chain perspective is really important. Dark web postings is another one. Of course, malware protection and that sort of thing. But really, I think if you think about defense in depth, and I'll talk more about that in a second, but it's kind of the walls out is really what's important. I think here that's where oftentimes your first, especially if you sort of assume breach, that's going to be the first indicator. So dark web monitoring and monitoring of a lot of these channels, or as many as you can manage, either through a threat intelligence vendor, threat intelligence team, however you set this up, is what's really critical. Because that's oftentimes, unfortunately, going to be the first warning. Especially if you go back to that SpyCloud statistic, you can have EDR, you can have antivirus. If you're looking at that as being a 54% disruption, then you're looking at functionally a coin toss as far as whether or not that's going to work. So, you have to almost sort of assume a breach and keep monitoring. Act quickly when that's out there, which gets into the speed of action. I talked about the 65% of these credentials being out and available within a day. So again, like once it's popped, it's out there really fast, which means organizations have to be able to respond really quickly, detect and respond really quickly. So that's why sort of looking out is important. That walls out as opposed to just these sort of walls in security operations side of it. That threat intelligence walls out becomes critical and really becomes your first indicator oftentimes. And then of course defense in depth. And this is just sort of the classic kill chain. You want to have as many opportunities as possible to try and disrupt something like this. The great thing about that, about that walls out approach is it starts there. You can pick up if the credentials are out there and you're monitoring, that gives you your first opportunity. If somebody's trying to log in, some sort of account takeover, excuse me, and there's some sort of anomalous activity, that becomes the next one. Then, again, going to the impossible travel, although we've talked about some of the defensive or, defeat measures that they have for that, all the way through to, any sort of anomalous behavior detection. You got to check now if you're concerned that there's been a successful login, you've got to look at what activity may have been taken. So really, as many opportunities as you can have to disrupt this is what's really critical as well. So with that, I'll pause here for questions. There's my email address. If you ever have any questions, please feel free to reach out. I love talking about this stuff. After 35 minutes of straight talking, I'm going to take a quick pause and see if there are any questions.
Just an add-in, I was watching a documentary on like these hacker groups, these Infostealer groups, and it was just crazy that they had one supposedly individual was talking about how these groups are actually getting very organized, meaning they have an HR team, they have payroll, you can sign up for healthcare. Like it's
Yeah.
getting like a little crazy that they're doing this, and it's all through like Bitcoin or whatever crypto they can use to, try to harden their tracking. And it's just wild how these organizations are just developing and then going after the internet.
Yeah, they've got customer service channels now. If you're having a tough time installing your hardware or your software, they're like, don't worry, hit us up anytime, 24/7. There was one group in particular, they were Russia-based, that actually stood up, basically a front company to recruit, and it was legitimate. Obviously it wasn't legitimate, but they made it look as legitimate as they could. They stood up a company to say, hey, come work for us, we're pen testers, that type thing. And on paper, if you just look at it, there were people who were applying who probably had no idea that they were applying to a cyber criminal group. To your point, if you think about that chart I had up there as far as that specialization of I'm a traffer, I'm a coder, and they're just, they just keep developing more and more. And then I think our best hope is that eventually they end up in a series of soul-crushing meetings just like everybody else and can never get anything done. So eventually they'll find their own demise. Yes.
So you talked about how anti-malware and EDR solutions are not really effective. I'm just wondering, you work for LastPass. I mean, if we think about password managers, what can a password manager solution do to, I don't know, harden against those stealers? How do you think about it from that point of view?
Yeah, no, that's a great question. There's two things that I think that align with that. So one, as part of what we do is some of that dark web monitoring. So, if a credential shows up, we'll let you know. So there's that aspect of it. There's the walls out aspect of it. And then the other aspect of it too is that speed to action. So, okay, we know we've had somebody infected with a malware. We can immediately enforce a password change, and we can get it done like that. So it makes it much easier to kind of, see it and act on it in a much quicker fashion. Sure.
So the targets are beyond Windows, just of course they're targeting. Have you seen more esoteric kind of targets like IoT or routers or Mac, whatever?
Yeah. I mean, they'll target anything, certainly. Across operating systems as well. I mean, you'll find a lot of Infostealers buried in just about any app store. That's really common. So, certainly that means Android, iOS, everything across the board. Really with a lot of times, sadly, with the routers, they'll just use the default, like I was talking about the attacker in the middle stuff, where they'll get their foot in the door and then do the password sniffing there. But there's no aspect where they won't try and get their foot in the door. It's just, a lot of it's because it's so much like a business, it's just market share. So they tend to lean more towards kind of the typical Windows and Apple and Android, and then that's where their bread and butter is at. Sure. Mm-hmm.
You see that a lot of these, there's individuals that keep doing this. Are they trying to, other than being the monetary team, trying to build credibility in that community by doing these dumps, or do you think there's ulterior?
Yeah, I think that's a lot of it. And I think so, if you think about the RockU file that was released, RockU 2, 2024, however, that was 10 billion credentials. But none of those were new. But so I think there's an aspect of people, in smaller examples, just trying to monetize it. I think there's people trying to kind of make their name and draw, get the attention. Oftentimes they'll try and pivot to advertise other wares. Or other capabilities. And I think a lot of it too is they basically just become really useful tool sets for those sort of password spraying attacks, credential stuffing attacks. And I think somebody just takes the time to do it sometimes and just dump it out there because it makes it easier for everybody else. The more, it just kind of makes it a big data support kind of approach where now you've got a sample of 10 billion passwords that you can then, feed into models and everything else. And I think there's a couple of different reasons, and it just depends on, what that individual or group is looking to do, and it's not necessarily mutually exclusive across any of them. It can be any number of them. Absolutely. Any other questions? Yes.
With AI being out in the field now, generally accepted, do you see like an increase in script kiddies coming around again?
Yeah, it's funny. OpenAI just actually released a really good report just yesterday on how they're seeing OpenAI used in malware development. And a lot of that, there we're specifically focused on nation states. But really, I think the same holds true for cyber criminal groups. It is. It's helping them operate. It's helping them write the code, but if they don't know how to do it, they're still probably, it's not a shortcut like that. Like they're not going to go from 0 to 100, but it'll get them from like 60 to 90. You know what I mean? Like, I think we're seeing it more as an evolutionary vice revolutionary tool. I think there are people that are absolutely doing that, and I think that's coming where somebody, and we've seen it used to make polymorphic malware and stuff like that. But it is definitely lowering that technological barrier to entry. But I think especially on the code, like the true coding side and like malware development side, I think it's really more as a tool vice a shortcut so far. I don't think it's going to stay like that forever. I just think that's kind of where we are right now.
When I was playing with Lambda the same way, it took 4 hours to actually build a code to replicate a file.
Yeah. Yeah, that's the thing. Like if you ask it to just write a malware and you don't know how to code, and then it doesn't work, like good luck figuring that out. If you're not a coder, you're back at square one.
Then I got a question for you. With the national data breach, which impacts almost every single American, over 3 billion people impacted, why hasn't that really blown up in the news? I mean, I went in there and looked at some of the database. It's bad. Social Security number.
Oh, yeah.
Addresses 20 years ago.
Yeah, I've gotten.
It's not really, being discussed.
I think honestly, I think a lot of it's just people are just numb to it. I think there's just so much data out there. I mean, I know because I got all those emails too, and I don't even know. I couldn't even tell you myself how many emails I've gotten over the years that my Social Security number is out there. What I worry about with a lot of that data getting out there, and having some conversations, and not to pivot to sort of AI and deep fakes, but kind of tying back into it is with that sort of data out there, compiling all that into a larger database, training an LLM on it, combining that with some sort of deep fake capability, and then you start having a deep fake, like audio deep fake enabled, LLM enabled voice calling into a fraud center saying, hey, here's who I am. They can answer all the questions because they know where you went to high school. They know your social security number. That's with that stuff. I worry that we haven't seen the full impact of that sort of data being out there yet. And as it gets incorporated into sort of the larger milieu of scary technology, that's probably where we're going. But yeah. Yes. Yeah, now you've got somebody else that can get breached for you. Yeah, that's no, just from a personal perspective, and for better or for worse, I feel like I've just gotten far too many emails like that. If I don't know if I'm not familiar with the company that's offering the monitoring, I just won't do it. Like I know there's a couple out there that are trusted and that sort of thing, So if it's one of those, and honestly, I've done it so many times at this point, I don't feel like I need to do it anymore anyway. Or if I'm not sure, you can certainly investigate the company, do some research. But I do understand that hesitation. I would recommend, like if you know the company, that's one thing. If you trust the company, if you're not sure, do some research. I at this point, because I was part of that huge OPM breach, basically the government has just kind of has offered me monitoring for life. But the other thing is often, in my experience with a lot of those services too, is that it's not particularly user-friendly. Like you'll get a notification, but then you've got to log in to 4 different things, and or that you get too many notifications. But yeah, to your point, I agree that people need to be cautious with how and where they're sharing their data, even in response to those things. Yes?
Beyond password management type automated solutions that can notify you that you've got credentials that are compromised,
Mm-hmm.
what would you do personally if you get one of those notifications, your credentials are compromised, outside of the password manager and obviously changing the password on
Yeah.
whatever sites that you have, what other things would you do beyond that?
So like if I get a notification that my passwords are compromised, sometimes it can be as simple as standing up a new email account too, and starting all over if I'm concerned about that particular account. So now I'm changing 2 aspects of my credentials. That's one. That can be obviously highly painful, but there's some good tools out there for generating unique emails. That's one of those that just kind of you take, especially from a credential standpoint, you change what you can, and then keep an eye on things. Yes.
Just to add to the question, another thing that you can do is, not the best thing, but you can check through what you're running and check exactly what you have. Just go through your normal checks.
Yeah.
And make sure that you don't have anything hiding yourself.
Yeah. That's a good call. Thank you. Yes.
What are your recommendations in terms of avoiding a compromised edge router?
Yeah, that's a little outside my area of expertise. I would just, yeah, that was gonna be the main thing I was gonna say was, that's number one. Modern, make sure it's not end of life, make sure it's still getting updates and patched and that sort of thing. And just sort of the classic sort of IoT / I guess IoT router security recommendations, is changing passwords and making sure you're up to date and you're not using an old MikroTik router would probably be the number one thing I would recognize or would recommend. Ma'am, you had a question?
I was just thinking about two-factor authentication and MFA being, the big thing to be pushed, I think, in response to a lot of these attacks, such as Snowflake, for example. And instead of SMS, because of the easy nature of kind of spoofing SMS or SIM swapping, for
Mhm.
example, being such a threat, biometrics being part of that MFA.
Mm-hmm.
Do you see a threat in that replacement or that escalation to using biometrics and the introduction of such talented AI? Because when I think biometrics, like, whether it's your Face ID or not necessarily something that's, to be touched, but.
Yeah, I think we're probably we're heading there, and I feel like, I know I've certainly seen reports in the past of sort of initial reports around people using pictures to get around it, and this was a couple of years ago. I think some of the technology on the defensive side has advanced, but yeah, the amount of time until somebody can take a good picture, and certainly with the sort of social media presence and everything else that's out there now, being able to I don't know, for instance, 3D print a worthwhile model that could fool. And I mean, there's who even knows how they'll do it. And the other concern I often have, and it's not just me, but you can't change your face, you can't change your fingerprints once that data is out there. And if they figure out how to use it, there's a lot of concerns. So then it comes down to encryption in a lot of ways and how it's used. But yeah, I mean, I do worry about that. Any other questions? All right. Well, thank you so much again for taking the time. I really appreciate it. Thank you.